Welcome everyone here to our program today, sponsored by the Plant Initiative. And today's program is called The Vegetal Turn, a conversation with Marcello Di Paola. I'm Paul Moss, the Executive Director of the Plant Initiative, and I'm very excited to introduce Marcello and to start off our 1-hour program to talk about his new book, which will be co-moderated by Kate Brelge and me. And Laura Pastarfi, our previously scheduled moderator, was unfortunately not able to participate today due to a personal issue, but I'd like to note that Laura contributed one of the chapters in the book, which we will be discussing today. So Dr. Marcello Di Paola is an environmental philosopher, a writer, and a public speaker who is assistant professor in the Department of Humanities at the University of Palermo in Italy. He writes on ethics, aesthetics, political theory, and the history of philosophy. In addition to the recently published book, The Vegetal Turn, History, Concepts, Applications, which is the focus of today's program, among his other publications are Ethics and Politics of the Built Environment, Gardens of the Anthropocene, and the co-edited volume Plant Ethics, Concepts and Applications. Marcello is the founding president of Minima Urbania, a network devoted to environmental education and various cultural and creative activities. He also grows succulent plants professionally and is in the management team of Vivi Cuba. Dr. Kate Brelge is an environmental ethicist and a feminist philosopher with over a decade of teaching and research experience. She earned her MA in philosophy at Colorado State University in 2014 and her PhD in philosophy at Temple University in 2023. Especially interested in animal ethics and plant ethics, Dr. Brelge is the showrunner for the Networking with Plants in the Anthropocene podcast, where she interviews academics and practitioners working in the environmental humanities about their work with plants from across the globe. Her own work in the plant humanities centers on care ethics and plants. The program will start with a half hour of conversation between Marcello, Kate, and me. And then for the remainder of the program, Marcello will be responding to questions posed by you, the attendees, that will be presented by Kate or me as selected from questions that are posted in the Zoom chat. So we encourage you to please suggest a question for Marcello to discuss by posting it in the chat, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. This program is being recorded and posted online on the Plant Initiative's YouTube channel, and a link to the recording will be sent to everyone who registered. With that, I'm turning over the program to Kate.
Thanks, Paul. And thank you, Marcello, for being with us today. I'm so excited for your new book, The Vegetal Turn. And I'm really excited to get the opportunity to talk with you today. So
thank you, Kate. Very, very kind of you. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Paul. And to everyone here, thanks for this. It's wonderful to be here.
Wonderful. And I'm so excited to hear more about the Vegetal Turn. My first question is about your work with plants and gardens. You have been working on plants and gardens in particular for some time in your scholarly work. How did you start thinking about plants this way?
Oh, well, I was born among plants. And I am part Dutch and part Italian. The Dutch side of my family had a tulips business with crossing and patenting and all of that in early 20th century. Began at that time, and it's still ongoing, but it has been purchased now by non-Dutch, let's say. And whereas the Sicilian side, the Italian side, is a cactus nursery, it's a cactus farm. It's a very large cactus farm in Sicily, which was started by my grandpa. So I was born among plants and among people who cared about plants and knew plants. And when I came to philosophy, particularly environmental ethics, the little that I could read about plants was always centered on this idea that people were indifferent to plants or even blind to them, right? Which of course is true, but I had never seen that in my life. I've always seen the very opposite of plant blindness. So this idea that people didn't know plants or didn't engage with plants or somehow didn't let plants into their lives in the way that a proper relationship with plants would, sort of enable and require. I had no experience of any of that. So I thought, it must have something to do with life experience, all of this, and therefore the heavier philosophical issues must lie elsewhere. It cannot just be a matter of how people feel about plants or what they're used to. There's got to be also all of that, but there must be a philosophical core that is problematic, a problematic core in our relationship with plants that I thought was interesting to find out, coming out from a completely different perspective than I saw most environmental ethicists had when I'm thinking biocentrist thinkers or even representatives of care ethics and deep ecology. And I had no reverential attitude towards plants at all. So I thought, okay, let's see if maybe this can be looked at a little bit differently. And with gardens, it's roughly the same. I mean, gardens are places that are maybe artificial, maybe natural, maybe a little bit of both. Maybe it depends how you see it. And I thought, all of this is philosophically interesting. In addition, they are topics that force you to question typical ways of thinking that you might have or might have inherited. So maybe they don't give very good answers. Maybe plant philosophy is not really a receptacle of excellent answers, but you will come up with interesting questions, I think, if you reflect on about ways of being that you are somehow related to, but in ways that are confused to you still, and not obvious. And so this is I basically wrote about what I knew and what I thought I knew, let's say. Yes.
Great. Thanks, Marcello. Your new volume is focusing on the vegetal turn in the humanities. Can you
Yeah.
share for everyone what the vegetal turn is?
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, first of all, I'd like to deflate a little bit this title because I personally don't think that we have had a vegetal turn in the way that we had a digital turn or something like that. So our lives have not been changed entirely in the way that they have had with other turns. What I would say, it's more that this is the turn of the vegetal, right? We now think of the vegetal or plants or the vegetal world or whatever is around it. Well, I mean, this is one of the problems, right? Where does the plant world begin and end? And this is a problem that goes back to, ancient Greek thinkers. How far does this vegetality extend and so on? Well, but now we think of those things, and it's the turn of those things for us to think about, much as it was for animals with environmental ethics of the past 30 years. We know more about plants, thanks to a lot of work done in disciplines that are possibly not in the humanities, mostly in the sciences. And this leads us to new interests. And now we wonder, and how do we think of this universe of the vegetal that is so close to us and so all around us? In my case, I wouldn't even exist without plants because, you know, I come from plant people. So, and they met because of plants. So I wouldn't have existed otherwise. And it's really deep in me, but we have to find the words for it. We have to put our thoughts in order, and we have to connect our thoughts well. So the vegetal turn is the turn of plants for us to think about. This is the way I see it. The publisher means, of course, that our lives have been changed by plants now and that everything will be different. But that's not what I mean with it. Now, in terms of what it is, it's I would think of it as some kind of enlarged interdisciplinary cognitive mobilization of a number of scholars or non-scholars in many cases, or in meetings, let's say, between scholars and non-scholars that reflect on what plants do, what can they do, um, human relations with plants directly, and plant-mediated human relations. So all the ways that we come together as humans with plants in between us or around us. And of course, this takes us to things like agriculture or, you know, medicine, some of the most important aspects of being human. And so I think it has to do with a strong, probably not very well coordinated, or in a way also lacking in some kind of discipline, right? Putting together the book wasn't easy because we talk of interdisciplinarity as, of course, something we all like and we all want and we all need, and it is. But the truth is, you put together a philosopher and a sociologist in a room, and you have, you know, two people who don't necessarily understand each other the first 10 minutes. So it takes a lot of work to put together a vision that has order. And I think the vegetal turn in the humanities, it has been a very a powerful rise in interest in what plants can do, in what we can do with them, what are their values, what kind of values are they, and how do we reflect on them, how do we act on them. And then it is a big effort to somehow put all of these questions and answers into some kind of a structure without losing, of course, the famous interdisciplinarity and the many approaches, because the plant humanities go all, you know, from history all the way to the visual arts, and then there is philosophy all over the place, and literature, and of course anthropology and history, all kinds of, and then the sciences. Somehow all of this has to relate to what we know, either through the sciences in the Western sense or bodies of knowledge that are, you know, scientific, let's say, in other senses, or in any case, they bring us, you know, ideas and thoughts. And humans have always thought about plants. There is billions of different plants. So whatever I'm saying about any given plant might not necessarily be true about so many others. And so the work of the plant humanities, which is basically what the vegetal turn stands for, this new, you know, legion of different interests that have to do with plants, is to somehow get a single target and some kind of common language. And I testify it's not easy at all. But it is very interesting, and it is an exercise in intellectual diversity, which I enjoy very much, very much.
Thank you so much for that. It leads really well right into our next question, I think. So there is a bigger interest in all of these questions that diverse folks work on in the plant humanities as part of this vegetal turn. Are there any trends that you've noticed in changes about the conversations around plants, both in scholarly and popular channels? Have they been changing, or
Hmm.
do you think it's still so varied that it's hard to kind of pick up on trends?
Uh, so the scholarly part is probably, I have some kind of an answer. Hmm. So usually non-humans were discussed in environmental ethics. And we're talking from, mid 60s onwards. And this is a North American discipline, basically born in North America, which decided to follow one specific structure of analysis. It was analytical philosophy in most cases. And so the idea was, we take any non-humans and we see what their value is. This was ethics. So it was born as a normative enterprise, let's say. We see what their value is, if they have value in themselves, intrinsic value, if they have freestanding value, regardless of relations that they have with us humans, particularly relations in which we use them. Yeah. Forget instrumental value. Let's see if those entities that are non-humans have intrinsic values. And if they do, then something should follow. And the idea was, what follows is obligations that we have towards those entities. So this applied very well to animals, for a number of reasons. Animal ethics came out as a very powerful intellectual, very vibrant, and even politically influential in intellectual adventure, because all those steps worked out. Animals have some kind of intrinsic value. They're sentient. They can feel pain, so don't hurt them. And that's the obligation. So the structure of the work was very clean. So, of course, to bring this out into the real world and whatever political battles would follow from this, it's a whole other thing. But in philosophical terms, you had your work cut out for you. Now you move this to plants, it doesn't work as easily, right? And maybe plants are sentient, and maybe all of that is true, and maybe you do have some obligations towards plants, but it's not as clear cut. So, for example, I remember in 2008, many of you will know, there was an attempt to put in the Swiss constitution something like the rights of all creatures, let's say. That was the actual sentence. And it included plants, right? And then there was an appendix on what follows from animals having rights, which was more than 20 pages long. And then there was an appendix on what follows with plants having rights, and it wasn't even half a page. Because even if plants do have intrinsic value and even have rights in the sense that we think that animals may have rights, what follows from that? I grow plants professionally in as you guys said before. If in many cases, if you cut a plant in many pieces, then you just have more plants. Nothing dies. Nothing seems to be hurt in the way that we could observe in an animal. And so the typical structure with which environmental ethics works didn't really apply as easily. So what this meant was usually give up Kantianism and utilitarianism, if you want to stay within environmental ethics, and move on to care or virtue, which is something that happened. Virtue ethics and care ethics got a boost even from cases like plants and other beings, non-animal beings, or somehow get beyond this structure, intrinsic value and obligations. And this is how the conversation has changed, I think. Right now, when we discuss plant philosophy together, we don't work with this idea that the plant needs to have intrinsic value and we need to have duties. We have a different kind of job cut out for us, which is how do we think of our relations with plants now that we know that those kinds of structures like intrinsic value and obligations don't really apply. So it's a much more creative work that needs to be done. And I think plant philosophy has somehow found its own voice now and is no longer a department of environmental ethics. And it's in a way a little bit more flexible, let's say, as an approach. And even if plants have intrinsic value, or excuse me, even if they have instrumental value, no one is appalled by the idea that perhaps it's good to learn what instrumental values do they actually have, right? Except what we've been told in now. So even just more attentiveness and a whole lot more engagement. But this is easy to expect from scholars, you know, as the debate progresses, we will come up with something because that's our job, right? Now, from the general population, which is the second part of your question, this is a much harder story because I mean, people talk more about plants. You will find articles on the Financial Times now about, you know, succulents being poached. And I do this because I grow succulents, not because I poach them. But there was an article a week ago on succulents and poaching in South Africa. It was a long article in the Financial Times. There was another one in the Guardian. There is a huge interest, and as everybody knows, during and after COVID, you know, people somehow got interested in plants, and Instagram also helps because people now take pictures of their plants, and so there is a lot of interest there. But for the, let's say, cultural popular debate to develop, we need much more. We need far more concrete things to happen. So, for example, cities need to be designed differently. People need to have a chance to engage with plants in their cities, for example, right? Whereas right now we have a whole lot of keep off the grass kind of thing. And so if you want them to keep off the grass, well, want all of us to keep off the grass, then for one thing, we will never really engage with grass. And that's not going to help our search for a more sophisticated, a more nuanced relationship with plants. So in terms of the popular discourse, let's say, a lot of work needs to be done on engagement, actually having the chance to engage with plants, and imagination, what we think of when we think of plants, exactly, right? And in many cases, in many cities, they're just called green areas, and it's a matter of city decorum to have plants. It has to do with looks and aesthetics. And I'm not saying this is not important, but this is just a little bit. And you know, the popular imagination needs to fly a little higher to see much more. And of course, you can think of the Amazon forest and all of that, but that's not going to help with your everyday engagement with plants. So more than talk, I think we need a lot of practice with plants when it comes to us people outside academia or journals. So that's longer. That's going to take longer, I think.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much. The next question is you've already touched on a little bit, but just what you see as the potential future impacts of the vegetal turn, maybe on society or otherwise.
Well, I mean, in philosophy, it was let's start just with in philosophy it was interesting because the way a lot of people went about it, for example, Michael Marder with fantastic work, right? The first thing they thought about when discussing plants was a little bit metaphysics, right? So they thought, okay, these beings have never been easily categorized in Western metaphysics. So they might be a liminal case that allows us to reconsider a number of elements of Western metaphysics. And of course, this is, if this works, if you manage to open an avenue like that, and Michael managed for sure, then you have triggered a large discourse, not just on plants, but on Western metaphysics, which is and it could have been it happens to be plants, and you found plants as a way in, and now you're rediscussing the way we have been thinking about being for millennia. Of course, if you do this, you will learn that there are alternatives to Western metaphysics, not only both outside Western metaphysics and within Western metaphysics. And so, for example, Michael has done a lot of work on what it is to be an individual and what it is to be a collective, and plants, of course, and this is central in Western metaphysics, the one and the many, and so on. And plants put that in trouble, in question in a number of ways. But then, of course, you can read Spinoza, which is as Western a metaphysics as you get. And you learn that not everyone thought that the one and the many were two different things. You learn that there is a language to talk this new metaphysics that just needs to be innovative. And this language can be brought into discussion, for instance, with indigenous knowledges that are, somewhat Spinozistic, or maybe vice versa. And and suddenly you have a whole new avenue of research, right? Same thing with plant minds. I mean, this forces you to reconsider what mind is. And maybe plants have intelligence, but they have no representational mind. And so your notion of intelligence needs to change. And this is a whole putting into question. These are impacts, I think, already of putting into question the ways we look at things. Now, from the point of view of ethics and politics, it depends on a number of factors, right? In a way, when I read or write about plant ethics, usually I have the impression that in the end, what I wrote is, people be more careful with plants, but if you need to mow your lawn, you can still do it. And how could I say otherwise? And if you have grown a tomato, eat it. The thing is alive. But so the ethics, again, I'm very skeptical that, as I'm sure is clear by now, that we can come up with obligation systems with plants. But I think, much in the way in which you refine your metaphysics and you refine your idea of intelligence, you can refine your relationship with plants. Refine, not improve necessarily or change necessarily, but work a little bit more on this. Of course, you can go political, let's say, about this and say that plants have rights. But that, for instance, but that will force you to redefine rights. So the real impact is a whole lot of new work to do for anybody who wants to have an impact in this field. I mean, if we are to make a difference with the plant studies and philosophy and humanities, real impacts into the world, then we need to sharpen our arguments a whole lot. And so the first impact is on us to do a whole lot of work better, because the relationship we have with plants is in many ways confused, I think. Right? Sometimes is very effective, sometimes very rationalistic, sometimes is plants are a nuisance, sometimes are a commitment. And so we keep on, working with all those categories, but truly we have to put them in order and see how it goes. In terms of politics, is really difficult, of course, because, particularly democracies, but not only. One idea with the body politic usually is that it is a bunch of people who do things, or a bunch of entities who can initiate and pursue political action. Let's call them agents, right? Political agents. Now, plants and animals and many other beings, and who knows what we will think about artificial intelligences, but in theory, they are not for our political systems. They are not agents, and not being agents, they don't really have jurisdiction in politics. And so structurally, we have cut them out, let's say. Now, how do you take non-agents into consideration in the political realm if they don't vote, don't speak, don't do all the things that we consider politics to be, right? So again, it's the real impact is to notice a challenge, which is there because, of course, some interest of friends need to be taken into consideration for our own interest, even. Just that is enough, right? And we need to find a political language for that and political procedures for that. Very difficult. But the very fact that we are starting to discuss this question, this is, I hope, a little bit of an impact, I think.
Thank you for that, Marcello. I think we are going to transition into listener and audience member questions. And this kind of is a response to the claims, for example, that you were just making, maybe not about political agency, but claims about plants having qualities or characteristics or capabilities like agency, intelligence, and consciousness coming from other parts of the plant humanities. And so Jennifer asks, or states, and then asks, I'm curious to learn why the intrinsic value being removed as an option in talking is an option in talking about plants. Research has shown that plants have agency, intelligence, and impart consciousness, depending upon how the word is defined, which goes back to your point about needing to kind of like re-envision these terms or redefine them. So does this not mean that they should be then accorded intrinsic value and thus carry all of the ethical implications that would ensue if things like agency, intelligence, consciousness are associated with what in the animal world, for example, might be considered the foundation or justification for intrinsic moral value?
Yeah. No, I agree. These are candidates, and I have a lot of colleagues who think and argue and convincingly in many cases, not only that plants have agency and forms of intelligence or consciousness, but also that something follows directly from that, which would be some kind of renewed. So basically, we would realize something about the ontology of plants. This is how plants are. And they are surprisingly not the way you thought them to be. They think, they act. And then it follows that your ethics should change, right? And this is more or less the way it worked with animals. And it goes with the category intrinsic value. The idea was we find out that animals, and it was pretty easy with at least some animals to learn that they suffer pain, for instance. And then something follows. The problem that I have with this is that we don't have a very clear idea. We humans, we don't have a very clear idea of what agency is in us, what intelligence is even in ourselves, and what consciousness is. We do come up with, excellent, of course, working definitions so that we can do a lot of work on it, and we do, but they usually fit interests that we have, theoretical or practical. So we will call intelligent usually something that surprises us in creative ways, right? Descartes had this idea that something is intelligent if it has flexible responses to stimuli. If it always does the same thing in response to something else, then it doesn't come up with anything, then it isn't intelligence, right? So this was the one possible way of going about it. Now, and consciousness is even worse. I mean, the philosophy of consciousness is as mysterious as anything is for the brightest minds in the world, right? They confront this issue of what consciousness is, and they're mostly at a loss. So the reason why I would hesitate, and now I'm going to go directly into a response here, a normative position. The reason why I would hesitate to bet everything, or to bet even a little bit, I would say, on the intrinsic value procedure, right? Intrinsic value, therefore obligations, is because we're going to be discussing intrinsic value is going to be huge concepts like agency and consciousness, of which we're very unsure about, extremely unsure about. So I think it's, I know a lot of people would disagree with this and think, oh, come up with a good story here and you're going to have a solid story for ethics and so on. But I think actually, no, I think it would be a very volatile story that will depend on whatever definition of consciousness one day somebody else would decide to apply, if, just to make my point clear. Whereas you can work, and virtue ethicists basically do this, right? You don't need to know if a plant or any other being has intrinsic value. You just need, it has ethical value for you because your adventure in life is also constituted by relationships with those beings. And those relationships can be very nuanced and rich and meaningful, even if those things don't have any intrinsic value at all. So I think a lot of work in respecting plants or treating plants with some awareness and so on can be done regardless of the question whether they have consciousness or agency, which is, of course, not to say that that is not a super important question. But I wouldn't go with consciousness, for example, because we hardly know what it is in ourselves as individuals, right? Let alone a general definition in humans. And instead, we can refine our ways of being with plants starting immediately tomorrow. And even if you treat plants as objects, there is a number of different objects and different ways of treating objects that you can learn. Some people treat certain objects with mastery, and some others just use them and throw them away. That's not exactly the same thing. And so in developing knowledge, even in using plants as instruments. Again, I'm a professional grower. I sell plants, right? I grow them to sell them. This is what I do. And but in that, so I treat them as objects. Of course, you couldn't do what I do with humans or animals, as a matter of fact. Even it would be a whole different story, right? But even with that, even with disregarding the intrinsic value that they have, I can work on knowledge, virtue, and meaning. I think more than obligation, what I am after when I talk and think about plants is the two big concepts is not value and obligation, but virtue and meaning. Meaning in life for me, for, you know what I mean? So sort of uh, creating a story that unites me with the plant rather than a theory that depends on concepts that I cannot really trust, as a matter of fact.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. We have another question that kind of follows up a little bit on what you were saying. It's a question from Aimee, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. What spiritual awakenings and practical actions are needed to cultivate ethical and sustainable human-plant relationships in the context of the vegetal turn?
Whoa. Well, but that's a huge question.
It is.
So how do I make this? So let me talk about myself, right? So like I said, I grow plants. I was born with people, you know, who grow plants, and all of my brother grows plants, my sister, everyone is involved in this. And basically, I know plants in two ways. This goes to the spiritual awakening. I start with that, right? So the spiritual awakening that I know with plants is actually very simple. If when I work with them as a grower, as a seller, as a businessman, what goes on is basically what went on with plants in botanical gardens, with animals in zoos. There is curiosity, and then there is control. These are two. So I'm curious about this thing that is not about me, but I need to control it, right? I need to take over, right? To run a nursery or run a zoo, right? In a nursery, that's a commercial nursery, then there is a third level, which is profits. So it's curiosity, control, and profits. Now, profit means that I got to sell those things to other people, which means somehow understanding their desires. So I am in a fully all too human atmosphere. This is by day, right? At night, so as you guys know, succulents have a different kind of photosynthesis, right? So during the day, succulents don't really do anything. They are shut off. At night, they come alive because, you know, they lose less water if they open their stomata. And so they do the whole work of photosynthesis in two phases. There is a daily phase, and then there is a nocturnal phase when the stomata open. And this is why, in much popular knowledge, succulents are nocturnal beings, right? And they really are. They come alive at night. So if I walk into my nursery at night, plants no longer have names or prices or anything like that. They don't have sizes. All of that disappears. And this is my spiritual awakening, which I have every single time I visit my nursery, the garden, and the greenhouses at night, when those plants are actually awake. Yeah. Now, at that point, these plants are just, I mean, not just, they are power to exist. They are things, they exist. They're power, right? Blunt power to exist that have no human categories attached at all. So the curiosity, control, profit sort of drops. That entire framework goes out the window at night. The spiritual awakening then is basically simply this having a chance to, and this may happen if one goes into a national park or into the jungle or just observes plants long enough, but meet plants outside the framework that you usually meet them in my case, that of a commercial grower, meet them at night. And that will be the kind of spiritual awakening as an individual that will sort of make you curious about this power to exist, which is a whole other power that you don't usually come in contact with when you think you're controlling those plants. So even if I do control my plants in the nursery heavily, right, and I stick them in boxes and on trucks and I do all those things, I just need to meet them outside that framework and I will find power of things that exist. And with that, I have enough of a different perspective to work with. But again, this requires engagement and options for engagement. And this is not easy in our urban, I'm lucky that way, of course, but not everyone can have nocturnal engagements with succulents. And clearly there's got to be other ways. When I wrote the book on urban gardens, I claimed it was urban gardens. I claimed we needed a system of urban gardens in all cities. And I made a long story that this would make it better for climate change and so on. And that's also important. But most of all, it would give us chances and context to learn some kind of spiritual new knowledge or awareness about plants, right? In terms of ethics, it's complex, because ethics is, again, it's a volatile enterprise. We all try to come up with rules or virtues or principles, and I think a lot of things need to sink in our everyday before we can actually build an ethical system. And so again, I would say that the ethics in question would be practice, plant practice, as much as possible. And with plant practice, you will learn some ethics, right? You will learn that the issue is not to not cut the plants. You can cut the plants, yeah? So the ethical issue must be something else, and faith in different ways. You can see sometimes I have, students or interns at my nursery, and when they start working with plants, they're very careful. They are very afraid that, they might hurt the plant as they pot it. If you see me or my brother or the people who work at the nursery with us potting things, we treat them like we do it in a nanosecond, and we are rough because we know what a plant can do, right? And Spinoza, when he was, in polemy with Descartes and saying, oh, this thing, my master Descartes has divided the universe into mind and body, but basically that's because he doesn't know what bodies can do. Bodies can do way more than what we know. And plants, our own bodies, can do things that we have no idea about. Spinoza was adamant about this, right? We don't even know ourselves, okay? And I think learning what a plant can do, even working, physically with it, that sort of puts you into a search for ethics almost automatically, because now you have to live with this, with knowing what happens to a plant when you do certain things and what happens to you when a plant does certain things. Because plants have a lot of power over me. For example, I wake up at 4:30 every morning, and I'll do this for the rest of my life, because plants need me to be there at 6:30 and somehow tell everyone what to do and tell myself what to do. And this rules my life. So again, it's engagement and practice that builds the ethics, not the other way around. It's you don't come up with an ethics and then start doing things, at least not with plans. I don't think this is the way it goes.
Thank you for that. So our next question maybe returns a bit to some of those things that you might connect with when you do work with plants. But I know that this is like allegedly one of the hard philosophical questions. So
Mhm.
totally understand if you don't have an answer. But Fatima asks, how do you understand consciousness? And do you extend that to plants and in what ways? I know.
Mhm. So, um, so, all right. So let's come clean here. I am what is in metaphysics known as a panpsychist. So I think that the universe thinks or somehow as a mental powers. Okay? Everything in the universe, everything in everything. And again, I'm a Spinoza scholar, right? So and you don't really have much of a choice if you're not a dualist, right? I mean, you can become a physicalist and then you cannot explain consciousness, or not very easily at least. Or you become a panpsychist and you say, yeah, there are bodies, and for every body there's got to be a mind. And then you'll come up with your version of panpsychism. Now, my version of panpsychism is Spinozist. So the main issue is not consciousness, because which is what panpsychists are after today. The wide whale of contemporary panpsychism is phenomenal consciousness. How do I, in a fully physical world, what explains that there is a quality to my subjective experience, that there is something that it is like to be me, right? That's the closest definition we have from Thomas Nagel, and from a philosopher to scientist. The definition sort of worked for everyone. So this is how we define phenomenal consciousness, however, roughly nowadays. And then the question is, um, uh, um, what is consciousness? Where is consciousness? And panpsychists say, well, it's got to be everywhere, right? Otherwise, we can't explain it just emerging it from physical things. Now, Spinoza didn't think that. Spinoza thought the concept was thought itself, right? The attribute of being is thought, is not individual consciousness. Individual consciousness is the same consciousness that gets confused about many things, that believes that a stick in the water is warped. That's consciousness, right? But thought is a whole other story, according to Spinoza. Thought is a power of nature. Yeah, it's not an incarnation of this power, it's the power itself. So I would think that consciousness comes later as a philosophical problem than thought, and I would stick with thought. So as a panpsychist, metaphysically speaking, I do think that plants think, and they think in ways that somehow correspond to the complexity of their bodies. And their bodies are complex. So there's got to be a whole lot of thinking going on. And by that, I mean plants get things, but they don't have representational thought. I don't believe they have representational thoughts, but they get things. What do they get? What is their intellection of? Of whatever is involved in their being. So the roots understand things, the leaves understand things. But when I say understand, I mean something like get, okay? That has nothing to do with consciousness necessarily, right? Um, Phenomenal consciousness, I have no idea how it should be defined and so on. So I think with plants, for example, the best thing is to stick to something like thoughts and intelligence. And by and actually in Spinoza's language, thought and intelligence are pretty much the same thing, right? Because thought means intelligence for Spinoza, basically. So I think plants are intelligent as everything else is, and that what that means is there's a whole lot of clicking going on, a whole lot of getting going on, even at subatomic level. All of this would apply, but this is entirely different from phenomenal consciousness. And once again, phenomenal consciousness is the most elusive, or among the most elusive philosophical issues that exist. So if I had to, be campaigning for plants, I wouldn't go for phenomenal consciousness. I do think that plants are intelligent, but not in a representational way. They don't necessarily have thoughts of any kind, but they do get things that matter to them as beings that have a certain bodily complexity. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that answer. We're about out of time. And I just wanted to mention that a couple people there's many more questions than we could get to today, and I'm sorry that we can't get to all of these. Because this has been a great audience in terms of really putting together some very thoughtful questions here. One question that has come up is just about obtaining copies of the book. And as people know, the publisher has offered a 20% discount on purchasing the book, but that's still, quite a bit of money, as people pointed out. But
Yeah.
one thing is that the book can be available or made available through libraries, through a university library or a public library. So if you're interested in in reading the book and are not able to purchase the book, you could go to your local library and request that they obtain the book for you. So it's not like this book would have to be off the table for you, even though it's kind of expensive. Would you like to say any, like for a minute or so, Marcello, any final words, or Kate?
Kate, please, I've spoken enough. I just want to thank everyone for opportunity, the questions, the patience. Of course, I tend to go long with my answers, so thank you. But Kate, please, definitely take over. Thank you.
I would just like to extend my gratitude as well. I love hearing about different positions within plant philosophy and the plant humanities. As was mentioned, I come from the more, I think, probably conservative approach of like intrinsic value and care ethics, although I'm very drawn to a care ethics that doesn't require you to justify the intrinsic value of the participants in it, that the relationship itself has certain features and that's what's important. So I think I really enjoyed your discussion of just kind of like where things are in the field, and there's just so much great work happening right now. It's really exciting.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much to Marcello for your great thoughts and perspectives, and to Kate for co-moderating, and all of the audience members for sharing your stimulating questions. This program has been one in a series of online events from the Plant Initiative about the human-plant connection. And we're planning another online program on March 18th called Plants in the United Field, featuring UK-based plant writer, nature mentor, reconciliation ecologist, and broadcaster Pete Yo. And we hope that you'll join us for that free event as well. So thanks again to everyone for attending today. I'll hopefully be able to post the recording online. If some of you people have missed some of the program today, it'll be on our YouTube channel. And hopefully later today, I'll be able to do that. So thanks again. And if you'd like to support the Plant Initiative, we're always appreciative of any donations through our website at plantinitiative.org, and wishing everyone a great day. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Kate. Bye-bye. Thank you.